Welcome, dear viewers, to a heartwarming tale of second chances, unexpected heroism, and the transformative power of love in the high-stakes world of fine dining. Enjoy the story. The crisp winter air nipped at George Hartley's cheeks as he paced back and forth in the nearly deserted city park. At 47, he cut an impressive figure salt and pepper hair artfully tousled, a tailored wool coat hugging his still athletic frame. To any passerby, he looked every inch the successful businessman he was. But right now, none of that mattered. His 5-year-old grandson, Paul, had vanished. "Yes, Jenny, I've got him," George lied into his phone, trying to keep the panic from his voice as he spoke to his daughter. "We're having a great time. I'll have him back by dinner, don't worry." He ended the call and frantically scanned the park. "Paul!" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Paul, where are you? This isn't funny anymore." George's mind raced. How could he have been so careless? One moment, Paul was gleefully chasing pigeons, and the next, gone. He cursed himself for getting distracted by that damned phone call. As he jogged towards the playground, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. George's heart stopped. He knew that voice. "Paul!" he yelled, breaking into a sprint towards the sound. It was coming from the direction of the river. George's feet pounded against the frozen ground as he raced towards the riverbank. His breath came in ragged gasps, forming small clouds in the frigid air. As he crested the small hill overlooking the water, his worst fears were realized. There, in the middle of a partially frozen section of the river, was Paul. The boy's small arms flailed wildly as he struggled to keep his head above the icy water. "Oh God, Paul!" George cried out, his mind blank with terror. He knew he'd never reach the boy in time. Suddenly, a blur of motion caught his eye. A woman, bundled in a threadbare coat, was dashing across the ice. She moved with surprising agility, her feet barely touching the slippery surface as she made her way towards Paul. George watched in awe and terror as the stranger reached his grandson. With strength that belied her slight frame, she plunged her arms into the frigid water and hauled Paul out. The ice creaked ominously beneath them as she began to inch her way back to shore, cradling the soaking wet child against her chest. By the time George reached the water's edge, the woman had almost made it. He waded in, heedless of the bone-chilling cold, and helped them onto solid ground. "Paul, oh thank God!" George sobbed, gathering the shivering boy into his arms. He turned to the woman who was now trembling violently, her clothes soaked through. You saved him. I can't thank you enough." The woman attempted a smile, her teeth chattering too much to speak. George made a split-second decision. "Come with us quickly. We need to get you both warm." Without waiting for a response, he scooped up Paul and gestured for the woman to follow. They hurried towards his parked Mercedes, leaving wet footprints in their wake. The opulent foyer of George's mansion was soon awash with frantic activity. Olivia, the ever-efficient housekeeper, whisked Paul away to a hot bath, leaving George alone with the mystery woman who had saved his grandson's life. "The bathroom's just down the hall," George said, gesturing. "There are plenty of towels, and I'll have Olivia bring you some dry clothes." The woman nodded gratefully and disappeared into the bathroom. George paced nervously, his mind reeling from the day's events. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? And how could he ever repay her for what she'd done? 15 minutes later, they were seated in the plush living room, steaming mugs of tea warming their hands. The woman, now dressed in borrowed clothes that hung loosely on her thin frame, looked around the room with barely concealed awe. "I'm George," he said, breaking the silence. "And you are?" "Helen," she replied softly. "Helen Reeves." "Helen, I can't thank you enough for what you did. If there's anything I can do to repay you—" Helen's eyes dropped to her lap. "Actually," she said hesitantly, "I've been looking for work. I don't suppose you know of any openings, anything at all?" George leaned forward, intrigued. "What kind of work are you looking for?" Helen's laugh was tinged with bitterness. "At this point, anything. No one seems to want to hire an ex-con." The words hung in the air between them. George's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but to his credit, his expression quickly softened into one of compassion. "Ex-con?" he probed gently. Helen nodded, her shoulders slumping. Got out 2 months ago. First and only offense, I swear. But it doesn't matter. One look at my record and every door slams shut. George leaned back, considering. He thought of Paul, safe and warm upstairs, all thanks to this woman. Ex-con or not, she'd risked her life without hesitation. That had to count for something. Well, he said slowly, as it happens, I do know of an opening. How do you feel about restaurants? The hustle and bustle of the kitchen at Hartley's, George's upscale restaurant, was a far cry from the sterile quiet of Helen's recent past. She moved through the organized chaos with a sense of purpose, her eyes bright and alert as she absorbed every detail of her new environment. George watched her from the doorway, a small smile playing on his lips. He'd taken a chance on Helen, starting her as a kitchen assistant. And so far, she was exceeding all expectations. She approached each task, no matter how menial, with a focus and determination that impressed even his veteran staff. As the weeks passed, George found himself spending more and more time in the kitchen, ostensibly to oversee operations, but in reality to observe Helen. There was something about her, a hidden depth, a flicker of expertise that seemed at odds with her position as a novice kitchen hand. His suspicions were confirmed one hectic Friday evening. The restaurant was packed, reservations spilling over into the bar area. In the midst of the dinner rush, George noticed Helen confidently step up to one of the cooking stations, effortlessly taking over for an overwhelmed line cook. Her movements were fluid, precise. She handled the pans with the ease of a seasoned chef, expertly plating dishes that looked like works of art. George's jaw dropped. Who was this woman? As the night wound down and the last customers trickled out, George approached Helen, who was wiping down her station. That was quite a performance, he said, causing her to start slightly. Where did you learn to cook like that? Helen's cheeks flushed, and she avoided his gaze. Oh, picked up a few things here and there. George raised an eyebrow. A few things? Helen, what I saw tonight was years of professional experience. Why didn't you tell me you were a trained chef? Helen's shoulders slumped, and when she finally met his eyes, the pain he saw there made his heart ache. Because, she said softly, that part of my life is over. Or at least, I thought it was. George's office was uncharacteristically chaotic. Papers were strewn across his usually immaculate desk, and he paced back and forth, phone pressed to his ear. Yes, Senator, I understand the importance. Of course, we'd be honored. This Friday? Yes, we'll make it work. He ended the call and slumped into his chair, running a hand through his hair. A soft knock at the door made him look up. Come in, he called out, straightening up. Arthur, his head chef and old friend, limped in, his leg encased in a bulky cast. Hey, George, you look like you've seen a ghost. What's up? George groaned. Senator Williams is coming for dinner on Friday, with a delegation of foreign diplomats. Arthur whistled low. Big fish. But we can handle it, right? I'm laid up, but the team? That's just it, George interrupted. The senator has requested a special menu, fusion cuisine with elements from each diplomat's home country. It's not our usual fare, Art. I'm not sure we can pull it off. Arthur's face fell. Damn, that is a pickle. Have you told the staff yet? George shook his head. I'm about to. I don't know what we're going to do. Moments later, the kitchen staff was gathered, faces a mix of excitement and apprehension, as George explained the situation. So, he concluded, I'm open to any ideas. How do we make this work? A heavy silence fell over the group. Then a quiet voice spoke up from the back. I might be able to help. All heads turned to see Helen, looking nervous but determined. You? One of the line cooks scoffed. No offense, but you're just a kitchen assistant. George held up a hand to silence the murmurs. Go on, Helen. What did you have in mind? Helen took a deep breath. If I could see the guest list and their dietary preferences, I think I could put together a menu that would work. I have some experience with international cuisine. The room erupted in whispers. George studied Helen intently, his mind racing. Could this be the solution they needed? All right, he said finally. Show us what you've got. The kitchen fell silent as Helen pored over the guest list, her brow furrowed in concentration. The staff watched in a mixture of curiosity and skepticism as she scribbled notes, muttering to herself. Finally, she looked up. "Okay, I think I have something." For the next hour, Helen outlined a menu that left everyone, including George, stunned. She deftly wove together elements from each diplomat's cuisine, creating innovative fusion dishes that sounded mouth-watering. For the appetizer, we'll do a deconstructed sushi roll, but with a Middle Eastern twist. Saffron-infused rice topped with seared tuna and a pomegranate reduction. As she spoke, George watched the skepticism on his staff's faces melt into admiration. Even Arthur, listening in via speakerphone, sounded impressed. When Helen finished, the kitchen erupted into excited chatter. George quieted them with a raised hand. "Helen," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and confusion. "This is incredible, but I have to ask, how? Where did you learn all this?" Helen's face fell, and she seemed to shrink into herself. I think we should talk privately, Mr. Hartley." George nodded, leading her to his office. As the door closed behind them, he turned to face her. "All right, Helen, I think it's time you told me the whole story." Helen sank into a chair, her eyes fixed on her hands. "I used to own a restaurant," she began softly. "A good one. It was my dream, my whole life." As Helen's story unfolded, George listened in stunned silence. She told him about her rise in the culinary world, her marriage to a fellow restaurateur, the birth of her son, and then the embezzlement, the threats, the tragic death of her child. "I lost everything," Helen whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My son, my restaurant, my freedom. When I got out of prison, I swore I'd never step foot in a kitchen again. But then you saved Paul," George finished softly. Helen nodded. "And you gave me a chance. I'd forgotten how much I loved this world, how much I missed it." George leaned forward, taking Helen's hands in his. "Helen, I am so sorry for everything you've been through, but I want you to know you have a place here, not just as a kitchen assistant, but as a chef, if you want it." For the first time since he'd met her, Helen's smile reached her eyes. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Hartley." "George," he corrected gently. "Call me George." The night of the senator's dinner arrived, and Hartley's was abuzz with nervous energy. In the kitchen, Helen moved with quiet confidence, directing the staff with the ease of a seasoned conductor leading an orchestra. George watched from the sidelines, marveling at the transformation. Gone was the timid kitchen assistant. In her place stood a master chef, completely in her element. As the first dishes left the kitchen, a hush fell over the dining room. George held his breath, waiting for the reaction. And then, "Exquisite," Senator Williams's booming voice carried to the kitchen. "Simply exquisite. Who is responsible for this culinary masterpiece?" George beamed with pride as he approached the table. "Senator, distinguished guests, I'm pleased to introduce you to our chef for this evening, Helen Reeves." Helen emerged from the kitchen, her cheeks flushed with exertion and excitement. As she described each dish to the enthralled diners, George couldn't take his eyes off her. She was radiant, confident, alive in a way he'd never seen before. The evening was an unqualified success. As the last of the guests departed, full of praise and promises to return, George found Helen in the kitchen, supervising the cleanup. "Helen," he said softly, causing her to turn. "That was incredible. You're incredible." Helen blushed, ducking her head. "Thank you, George, for everything, for giving me this chance." As their eyes met, George felt a flutter in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply smiled, wondering at the new feelings stirring within him. Weeks turned into months, and Helen's star continued to rise at Hartley's. Under her guidance, the restaurant's reputation soared to new heights. But as Helen flourished, George found himself increasingly distracted. He caught himself watching her as she worked, admiring the grace of her movements, the passion in her eyes as she created new dishes. More than once, he had to shake himself out of a daydream, wondering what it would be like to hold her, to kiss her. One evening, as they worked late going over the books, George finally gathered his courage. "Helen," he began, his voice uncharacteristically nervous, "I was wondering if you might like to have dinner with me sometime. Not here, I mean. Somewhere else. Just the two of us." Helen looked up, surprise and something else. Was it fear? Flashing in her eyes. "Oh, George, I don't think that would be a good idea." George's heart sank. "May I ask why not?" Helen sighed, setting down her pen. "You're my boss, George. And more than that, you. Successful, respected. I'm an ex-con with a past I can never fully escape. It wouldn't be right." "Helen, I don't care about any of that," George protested. "I care about you, the person you are now." But Helen shook her head firmly. "I'm sorry, George, I just can't." As she gathered her things and left, George slumped in his chair, wondering how something that felt so right could be so complicated. George's friend Arthur found him in his office, staring morosely at a glass of whiskey. "All right, spill it," Arthur demanded, settling into a chair. "What's got you looking like someone canceled Christmas?" George sighed, recounting his failed attempt to ask Helen out. Arthur listened thoughtfully, then leaned forward with a gleam in his eye. "You know," he said slowly, "there might be a way to show Helen that you see her as an equal. That restaurant of hers, it's still on the market, isn't it?" George's eyes widened as he caught on to Arthur's plan. "Art, you're a genius!" The next few weeks were a flurry of secret activity. George worked tirelessly, pulling strings and calling in favors. He had a vision, and he was determined to see it through. Finally, everything was in place. One evening, as Helen was closing up the kitchen, George approached her, trying to keep his excitement in check. "Helen, I was hoping you might join me for a short drive. There's something I'd like to show you." Helen hesitated, clearly remembering their last private conversation. But curiosity got the better of her, and she nodded. "All right, George, lead the way." As they drove through the city, Helen grew increasingly puzzled. "George, this neighborhood, it's where my old restaurant was." George simply smiled, guiding the car around one last corner. And there it was, Helen's old restaurant, but not as she remembered it. The dilapidated building she'd last seen was gone, replaced by a gleaming facade, and above the door, in elegant script, were the words, "Helen's Place." Helen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "George, what? What is this?" George parked the car and turned to her, his heart pounding. "It's yours, Helen, if you want it. I bought the building, renovated it. It's ready to open whenever you are." Tears welled up in Helen's eyes as she stared at the restaurant, her restaurant. "But why?" she whispered. George took a deep breath. "Because you deserve it, Helen. Because you're an incredible chef and an even more incredible person. And because I love you." Helen turned to him, her eyes wide with shock. "You love me?" George nodded, reaching out to take her hand. "I do. And I know you think we can't be together because of our different backgrounds. But Helen, don't you see? This levels the playing field. You're not my employee anymore. You're my equal. Always have been, really." Helen's lips trembled as she looked from George to the restaurant and back again. "Oh, George," she breathed. "I love you too. I have for so long, but I was so afraid." George cupped her face gently. "No more fear, Helen. What do you say? Will you take a chance on us?" In answer, Helen leaned in and kissed him, pouring all her pent-up emotion into it. When they finally parted, both were breathless and grinning like teenagers. "Is that a yes?" George asked teasingly. Helen laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Yes, George, to all of it. The restaurant, us, yes." The grand opening of Helen's Place was the talk of the town. Food critics raved about the innovative menu, the elegant ambiance, and the inspiring story of its owner's comeback. In the bustling kitchen, Helen moved with confidence and grace, directing her staff with the expertise of a seasoned pro. Through the service window, she caught George's eye as he charmed the diners, every bit the suave restaurateur. As the last plates were cleared and the staff began to clean up, George slipped into the kitchen. He wrapped his arms around Helen from behind, planting a soft kiss on her neck. So, Chef Reeves, how does it feel to be back on top? Helen turned in his arms, her eyes shining with happiness. It feels amazing, Mr. Hartley. But do you know the best part? What's that? Knowing that no matter what happens out there, she gestured to the dining room, I have you to come home to. George's heart swelled with love. Always, he promised, sealing it with a kiss. As they walked hand in hand out of the restaurant, both knew that they had found the perfect recipe, not just for success, but for love. Their pasts had brought them together, and now their future stretched out before them, as rich and full of possibility as a 5-course meal at Helen's place.
All right, everyone's presentations are done. Nick, the manager, said as he tried to move the discussion forward. Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something. Nick interrupted me and began to speak. There's apparently someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. His lackey, Mike, of course, agreed with Nick. I'm leaving. After leaving the meeting room, I started to shut down my computer. I noticed that an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking, there's no point in speaking up, no one will listen, I went home quietly. The next day, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. He was staring at his computer screen, his face pale. Nick? Is something wrong? Mike looked at the screen with him. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Knowing the reason for Mike's distress, I thought to myself, serves them right. My name is Adam. My mother passed away when I was in the 9th grade, and I was raised by my father. Well, you could hardly call it being raised. After my mother passed, my father changed. He drowned his sorrows in alcohol, and though he still went to work, he squandered our living expenses on horse racing. Because of that, I had to start working part-time as soon as I entered high school. Every month, I went to the convenience store with bills in hand that couldn't be auto-deducted from my father's account. Even though I endured it because I didn't want to be alone, I reached my limit in my 2nd year of high school and dropped out. I found a live-in job at a distant inn. Thank you for everything. The day I left home, my father, still staring at the TV, spoke. Take care. That was our last conversation. Back then, 18 wasn't the age of majority, so I needed my father's permission to work, and I couldn't hide my place of employment. Yet, my father never visited me even once. I kept working just to survive, and before I knew it, I was 42. Years of hard work paid off, and I was transferred to the headquarters. I was thrilled to be recognized by the company, as I thought I'd be working in the field until retirement due to my lack of formal education. Listen up. Our work can change the future of our employees. Don't drag us down. On my first day after the transfer, Nick, dressed in an expensive suit, spoke sternly. There was a reason for this. Our inn was located in a prominent tourist destination, known so well that everyone in the state could sing its commercial jingle. At its peak, we had 5 locations within the state. But that was long ago. Due to financial difficulties and aging facilities, only the place where I had worked for many years and the original establishment remained. I was prepared to lose my job anytime, but now there was a glimmer of hope. With the rise of social media, the tourist area where the inn was located started gaining attention again. Depending on how hard the sales department, where I was transferred, worked, we could either thrive or be forced to give up this prime location to the new hotel chains continuously popping up. For Nick, who had switched careers from another industry to strengthen our sales, this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. I understood why he had to be strict. I will do my best. Nick sneered at my enthusiastic declaration. Did you not hear what I said? I'm sorry. I thought I was listening carefully. Out of habit from years of customer service, I apologized reflexively, though I had no idea what had offended him. Someone was watching me with a smirk. In this department, there are those who are expected to excel and those who have been shoved here because they have nowhere else to go. You are the latter. It was Mike, the section chief. He's 7 years younger, at 35. But he was called to headquarters much earlier than I was and had been moving around within the headquarters ever since. I'm not jealous, but I can't accept that he's my boss. Graduating from a prestigious university, he has an unusually high pride and caused many problems as a newbie, making things very difficult for me when I was the front desk leader. When I found out Mike was transferred to the sales department a month before me, I was disheartened. Mike is right. With just a middle school diploma, there's not much you can do. Don't even think about achieving results. As if I didn't exist, Nick remarked, "I'm thirsty." Mike eagerly ran to the coffee maker. It seems Mike is Nick's lackey. I regretted being happy about my transfer to headquarters, wishing I had stayed on site forever. Send a direct mail to every company on this list by the end of the day. Nick only assigned me tasks that even a new graduate could handle. What? There are over 1,000 companies. You want me to send to all of them by today? Yes, if you and your fellow misfits split the work, even those with nowhere else to go should finish by today. I glanced at the employees typing away expressionlessly. They were worn out from customer service, only thinking about leaving on time, or were women reassigned after having children, with zero motivation for work. Even Sam, a new graduate from the same university as Mike, who was supposed to be among the expected achievers, had no enthusiasm for the job, having joined the company wanting to do customer service. "I don't care what they say, I plan to quit any time," he said. Only Nick and Mike were highly motivated, making all the decisions between the two of them. I originally only wanted to work at the inn to survive and had no particular attachment to this job. I swallowed my words, thinking I had no right to reprimand them. About a month after the transfer, Nick told us with a frustrated look, "To commemorate the 50th anniversary, we've decided to create a plan exclusive for one group per day." Originally, Mike and I were supposed to come up with it, but our president, Mr. Thompson, insists on hearing everyone's opinions. "So, you all get a chance." As Nick explained, Mike began handing out prints. "Make sure not to embarrass Nick. If your ideas are half-baked, you'll have to redo them." It seemed that they had printed his handwritten notes by Mr. Thompson, which included several questions and a section for free responses. It made sense why Nick had to seek our input, given that all responses had to be submitted to Mr. Thompson. We were given a week to think about it, and a meeting was scheduled to compile our ideas. My plan is to let guests enjoy both the old and modern America. Nick began the presentations. Guests would watch a master confectioner at a nearby traditional sweet shop make sweets in front of them. The welcome drink would be premium tea in a bottle. Nick's plan was certainly attractive. After his presentation, Nick called on us to present in the order we were seated. Just as I stood up for my turn. "All right, everyone's presentations are done." "Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something." Nick interrupted me. "There's someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer." He was likely talking about me. I joined the company as a part-timer and was made a full-time employee when I turned 20. That was 20 years ago, so Nick and Mike probably had no chance to know until recently. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. After that, Nick kept creating opportunities to solicit everyone's opinions, purposefully excluding me from speaking. The meeting unexpectedly heated up and went past the scheduled end time. A few people asked to leave, and the discussion continued with the remaining few. "Still here?" Normally, you'd leave in that situation. Though I had no attachment to the job initially, hearing kind words from customers made me want to make them happier. For someone like me, with nowhere to go, the inn was my home and customer service was my life. I felt pathetic about my current self. "I'm leaving." I left the conference room and started shutting down my computer. I noticed an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking no one would listen to what I had to say anyway, I quietly went home. The next day, while preparing the DM as instructed, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. In his haste to stand up, he hit his knee on the desk. He stared at his computer screen, his face pale. "Nick? What's wrong?" Mike, thinking he should be the first to rush over, approached Nick while still wearing his coat. He peered at the screen with Nick. and he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Who is responsible for this company? Nick, more irritated than ever, asked, and Mike answered without checking. Probably Sam. Sam wasn't there because he was attending a morning training session for new hires. Nick gave up on getting angry and returned his gaze to the screen. They were looking at an email that arrived right after the end of the working day yesterday. Apparently, no one, including me, had checked it before leaving. The email was from a large company that used us for their annual employee trips. The president and executives of that company also frequently used our services personally. President of the company, Mr. Mason himself, had declared that neither he nor his company would ever use our services again. Well, some companies cancel their employee trips or stop using our services due to financial struggles. Let's just move on. Mike kept wiping the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. Knowing why Mike was so agitated, I quietly watched their interaction. Do you know how much revenue we get from that company? We can find other guests to fill the rooms, but we'll lose the banquet costs, gift shop revenue, rental car fees, and more. Moreover, the gifts were supposed to be prepared by the traditional confectionery shop involved in Nick's proposed plan. If it's known that we incurred such a huge loss at this critical time, Nick's position in the company would be jeopardized. Nick took a deep breath, seemingly trying to calm himself. All right, Mike. Go to New York right now and apologize to Mr. Mason. What? You're coming with me, right? I have urgent work to do. I trust you, which is why I'm entrusting this to you. Please. Mike, believing Nick's sincerity, agreed with a determined look on his face, saying, yes. That's Nick for you. Even if Mike went to apologize, Nick would shift all the blame onto him if the client didn't change their mind. Well, it was Mike's fault to begin with, so it served him right. About 3 hours later, Sam answered a call from somewhere and repeatedly apologized, saying, I'm very sorry. Everyone watched to see what was happening. After ending the call, he informed Nick with a weary tone. When Mike arrived at the client's company, he only made things worse, further infuriating Mr. Mason. He was demanding, get his boss here immediately. It was no wonder Sam was exhausted, dealing with such a call right after returning from training. What is that idiot doing? All right, Adam, you're coming with me. If sacrificing Mike didn't work, then I must be next. Normally, I'd want to refuse at all costs, but I saw an opportunity in this situation. If I can be of assistance, I'd be happy to join you. I immediately followed Nick, and we flew to New York. When we introduced ourselves at the reception, it became clear how serious the situation was, as the receptionist personally escorted us to the president's office. Angry voices leaked through the door, making both Nick and me uneasy. Excuse me. I'm Nick, the supervisor. I understand my subordinate has caused you trouble, and I deeply apologize. Nick, with his experience in the corporate world, knew enough to offer an apology before excuses. However, his customer service skills left much to be desired. I sighed as I saw Mike trembling like a small dog in the corner of the room. What kind of training are you giving your subordinates? Mr. Mason glared at Nick with a red face. The intensity of his gaze made even Nick take a step back. Regrettably, I joined this company only 2 years ago and was unaware of Mike's issues. I should have identified his shortcomings sooner. Indeed. I should have realized sooner. No sensible person would come to apologize and then give a lengthy presentation on the drawbacks of not using their in. Nick froze, his mouth slightly open. Suspecting the worst, I picked up the documents that had fallen to the floor. It seemed Mike hastily prepared these documents on the plane, listing the disadvantages. Disadvantage 1: if you change the venue for the company trip, employees might suspect it's for cost-cutting reasons, leading to a negative impression. Reading it aloud half-jokingly, Nick snatched the papers from my hand and checked the contents with a furious expression. Among the stack of documents was a receipt from a nearby convenience store's copy machine. I felt a pang of dread, hoping he hadn't shown the receipt as well. What do you think he said when I asked what kind of nerve he had to do this? I'm very sorry. Faced with the dire situation, Nick must have thought there was nothing left to do but apologize. In a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from him, he uttered words of apology. He said, I'm a Harvard graduate. I don't believe I said anything wrong. Mike! What have you done? Forgetting his plan to pin the blame on Mike, Nick yelled loudly, even in front of Mr. Mason. I didn't do anything wrong. You're still saying that? Look at him. Mike pointed at me with a shaking hand. I was assigned to headquarters in my 20s and now I'm a section chief. This guy only made it to headquarters at 42. Everything I've done proves I was right. So why are we losing the contract? Having said his piece, Mike collapsed to the floor. Of course. You were sent there because you had nowhere else to go. Mike never expected to hear such words from someone he looked down upon. He lunged at me, and Nick hurriedly stepped in to stop him. Mr. Thompson told me Mike is a quick thinker, and to take good care of him. There's no way he was pushed aside. Don't make things worse here. He didn't say quick thinker, he said only quick-witted, didn't he? I don't remember that part. I recalled the many troubles Mike caused when he was a newbie. When Mike was on the front line, his pride was so high that he never apologized to customers. Customer service, especially in our job, doesn't work alone. It brings both good and bad situations. If the front staff or housekeepers made mistakes, or the cleaning company didn't properly clean a room, one had to apologize to the customers regardless of personal fault. Mike, in such situations, would never apologize, insisting he wasn't at fault. This often angered customers, and as the front desk leader, I frequently had to apologize on his behalf. He caused complaints and disrupted operations, which is why he was quickly moved to headquarters. In departments where he didn't interact directly with customers, his quick thinking was beneficial and things went well. But it seemed his flaws were starting to show. Corporate reservations are supposed to be entered into the system by the sales representative. But a quick check yesterday revealed that more than 10 items were missing from the client's reservation. The handover document clearly stated what needed to be prepared. Why didn't you enter it into the system? Why do we have to give them special treatment? Filling rooms near the banquet hall, setting up all the food in advance. Specifying the brand of wine, they're too demanding. No wonder he always angered customers, I thought, feeling a headache coming on. Grouping them in rooms near the banquet hall is for our benefit too. It makes it easier for the staff to set up beds and serve breakfast since everyone's schedule is synchronized. As for the other requests, Mr. Mason suggested them to lighten our load. I didn't know that. Nick finally seemed to realize that Mike was the one who had angered the client. What did you say to them? I just told them we wouldn't give them special treatment anymore. We shouldn't waste effort on things that don't bring in money. I was utterly exasperated at his lack of understanding of customer service. Of course, we shouldn't comply with unreasonable demands. But carrying over successful practices from past stays makes customers feel remembered and enhances their experience. Good memories encourage repeat visits. That's part of our job. I looked down at Mike, who was sitting on the floor. In our job, nothing is a waste. Mr. Thompson likely moved you to the sales department, hoping you'd finally understand this. How do you think he feels now that you've failed to meet his expectations? Mike, tears in his eyes, fled the president's office. I was amazed he still hadn't apologized. You have it tough, Adam. It's okay, we're all employees of the same company. I deeply apologize for this disrespectful incident. Especially after all the care you've shown us. If it weren't for you, Adam, I really would have stopped staying here. When I heard you were moving to the sales department, I was willing to reconsider if you handled it. Seeing us talk so amicably, Nick's face contorted. Do you two know each other? Adam's service is excellent. I always requested him specifically. Normally, we don't accept specific staff requests, but we made an exception for Mr. Mason, adjusting my shifts accordingly. He had personally stayed at our hotel just before my transfer, and during casual conversation, I mentioned, I'm moving to the sales department soon. If I hadn't told him then, things could have been much worse. Please continue to take care of us. I look forward to it. On the return flight, Nick awkwardly offered me a can of beer. It's still working hours. Of course, I had no intention of forgiving him for a single beer. Nick might try to pin everything on Mike and avoid any consequences. While pondering this, a startling fact came to light. Nick, the tea bottles for the plan have arrived. I handed Nick a bottle labeled with our inn's name. They look good. What are you talking about? These are plastic bottles. I had assumed we would use the trendy, high-end bottling tea. But what arrived were ordinary plastic bottles of tea with customized labels. The only unique aspect was the label, which had the inn's name, making it look customized. Upon further investigation, I discovered that a substantial amount of money was set to be paid to the tea company. It was priced like bottling tea. Does this plastic bottle really cost $100 each? The tea inside is specially blended for us. The extra cost is for that. Wouldn't it be better to use another tea company? Or is there a specific reason we must use this one? As Nick continued to make excuses, I showed him a printed email. I informed the tea company's president, Mr. Mitchell, that we discovered irregular payments and he confessed. He said you two were high school classmates and planned to split the extra money. That idiot. Why did he confess? That's not important. You should worry about yourself, this could turn into a police matter. Opening the bottle cap, I suggested. How about calming down with this tea? It supposedly has a relaxing effect. Nick drank the tea frantically. In the following days, decisions were made about their fates. Mike was reassigned to the General Affairs Department, with no chance of transfer or promotion, as per Mr. Thompson's orders. As for Nick, since the payment to the tea company hadn't yet been made, he narrowly avoided legal trouble. Instead, he was encouraged to leave the company, and to avoid further complications, Nick submitted his resignation. Rumor has it that connections between HR departments have made it difficult for him to find new employment. Even though it was good to have those two gone, something unexpected happened in the sales department. Everyone became motivated and united in refining the 50th anniversary plan. In the end, my plan was adopted. We collaborated with the Tourist Information Center to provide personalized guides. The plan, tailored to the number of guests, was truly special for the 50th anniversary. Hey, is Adam's family coming to stay? I immediately booked that special plan for my family. Sam noticed it on the reservation list and quickly picked up on it. Yes, I'm inviting my father. That's great. I might invite my parents too. I lacked the courage to face my father just as Adam. But here, with the confidence Mr. Mason praised, I felt ready. The 50th anniversary plan was a perfect opportunity to reconnect with my father. I hoped to bring back the days when we could laugh together as we once did.